might begin proceedings by me being very happy to introduce Anne Hardy, our own PhD candidate, I think coming very close indeed to submitting. Yes. Is that right? But we won't ask details. It's always a touchy subject. But we're really looking forward to hearing Anne's paper today. Here is an asylum open, constructing a culture of government care in Australia, 1801 to 2012.
Thank you. Try to get an overview of the entire thesis and then a summary of each chapter. So you see the site in its entirety of its European use. This thesis explores the emergence of government institutions in the colony of New South Wales. Due to rapid change throughout the 19th century, there was a need for effective management and care of many of the colony's inhabitants, as well as a reorganisation of management systems. The Newcastle government domain, also known as the James Fletcher Hospital, is used as a case study to demonstrate how administrators used it to alleviate various problems in the colony. This study considers the series of events that saw this heritage place used as a solution to many of the colony's problems and whether in reality a planned approach was reflected at all, or whether it was more about dispersal. The thesis follows an early pattern of the colony and the strong theme of coal mining as related to the government domain and the series of policies implemented there. Newcastle was a testing ground for trial in various policies implemented to alleviate the colony's problems, that were mostly from Sydney. What resulted was the emergence of an accidental institution. For those that don't know the site, the James Fletcher Hospital is in the centre of Newcastle. It has Watt Street running sort of along here, Fletcher Park, and King Edward Park is here. So that was, we refer to it as the government domain because it captures its use and government theme related to the site. So the thesis statement, the inhabitants in New South Wales had significant needs in the first decades of colonisation, requiring urgent interventions by the colonial authorities. Thus a culture of government responsibility and intervention developed. This strengthened the colonial imperial government's role in caring for the inhabitants of the colony by opening institutions for them. Governmental action was necessary because there were minimal other formal or informal supports in place, such as charitable organisations and social networks to support the inhabitants. As was the case of Britain, so I think just alluding to when they settled in New South Wales, that there wasn't all those foundations and structures of what was existing in Britain. Instead, a strong culture of government intervention and provision of care developed in the colony and became general throughout Australia. This culture continues today and is particularly evident in the area of healthcare. An essential role of the imperial government, as well as the colonial government in New South Wales as it developed, was to care for the colonial residents. Because of the dependent status of the significant majority of the first settlers and a large proportion of residents throughout the 19th century, this caring role was developed earlier and more extensively in New South Wales than in Great Britain. This case study of government domains demonstrates how this space was applied to a series of uses in the colonial period, all of which were components of caring role, grounded there to create a multi-layered heritage site of national significance in the heart of Australia's seventh largest city. The manner in which the government domain evolved is representative of the ad hoc and accidental nature of its use. Once dedicated to public purposes, it was the answer to many of the colony's problems. Now, there was a letter I came across at the British Archives that really seemed to put in place what I've been thinking about the entire thesis, having done like a lot of the chapters and trying to reflect on where this culture of care had come from and why it was so strong. This letter here, I'll just read it out. After a careful examination of the convicts, I find upwards of 100 who must ever be a burden to the settlement, not being able to do any kind of labour from old age and chronic diseases of long standing. Amongst the males, two are perfect idiots. The sending out of the disordered and helpless leaves the jails and may ease the parishes from which they are sent. But, sir, if it is obvious that this settlement, instead of being a colony which is to support itself, will, if the practices continue, remain for years a burden to the mother country, the 930 mails that were sent out by the last ships, 261 died on board, 50 have died since landing. The number of sick this day is 450, and many who were not reckoned as sick have barely the strength to attend to themselves. So it just, I guess this particular letter just shows the magnitude of the type of people that were being sent at this particular time. So it was a letter from Governor Phillip to Lord Grenville in 1790, so it's fairly early, but showed that there were problems very early indeed. Governor Phillip had concerns about the long-term impact of the colony's ability to become self-sufficient by sentencing convicts to transportation for their welfare. It was clear that some of the convicts who were transported were disabled, and this would result in the need for a high level of care for them once they reached New South Wales. The culture of government care, which developed in Australia from the 18th century, was based on the expectation of the government taking responsibility of this care. There's certainly no grand plan to how this would proceed, and you really have to question how prepared authorities were in caring for these people they were sending out here. The development of government domain relates to the urgent needs of the colony, representing the foundations that were laid to construct a more effective management system. There were minimal initial planning, though from its early reorganisation and forward-thinking by colonial and imperial governments, the Newcastle government domain has been used continuously since 1804. It remains a government institution today. This thesis presents histories of the domain that are associated with mining, convictism and asylums, which until now has been mostly unacknowledged. Care is a theme that runs through the European use of the place to the current day, and it also relates to the cultural heritage conservation. The associations with the current use of the mental health care enables us to develop a better understanding of how the place was used by examining what exists there today. The study contributes to an understanding of Australian colonial culture by connecting history and heritage. This thesis is structured in three parts. The first part, Government Works at Newcastle Government Domain, 1804 to 1871, provides an historical account of the government domain and specifically looks at how the site was formed, including how authorities interacted with the site for the establishment of the asylum. It argues that an adaptability and resilience developed in the settlement at Newcastle, as well as a determination to care for inhabitants in the colony. The 1801 European settling of Newcastle was accidental. Its planning and development was haphazard. Its discovery came about not by the exploring party but by one searching for runaway Irish convicts. It was poorly set up and staffed, and the hasty resettlement in 1804 was a reaction to the Irish uprising at Castle Hill. The place was on the extremity of a peninsula and had an island effect. The discovery of coal was expected to provide the colony with a valuable export product. A letter from Governor King from Captain Hunter in 1802 suggests the government here in New South Wales might consent to have the colony supplied with fresh meat. This will no doubt relieve the experiences of the settlement and very much add to the comfort of its labouring inhabitants. Hunter referred to coal and timber as the only resources that could relieve the financial problems of the colony. An early experiment was the exchange of coal for fresh meat from the Cape of Good Hope. It was a way of contributing to the staple diet and the well-being of the inhabitants. This chapter discusses the government domain as the headquarters of the penal settlement when it contained Newcastle's government house and gardens. It was a seat of authority, the dwelling place of the commandants and destination of visiting officials. During this period, many artworks were produced that supported the building program, documenting the topography and government infrastructure. The rich visual art and colonial culture of the Macquarie period showed changes to the government domain where many government officials nurtured the cultural practices of the colony's finest artists, often producing art in collaboration with convicts. Most of the artists in Newcastle during the first decades were government artists who were primarily engineers, surveyors, botanists and engravers who produced art as part of their professions. Many had an eye for detail because they were expected to closely examine the subject matter they were drawing, take an accurate approach to the execution of their art, and their images therefore are fairly reliable, although not 100% exact. The occupational illustrators were caught between the world of fine art and the world of topographical illustration. So just to show you just a few of the artworks. This one's the earliest one showing the site in 1804, and it's a copy of the original. The original is lost somewhere. Ferdinand Bale was he was a botanical illustrator, and this is the only landscape work that he did in New South Wales. And there's a lot of fine detail because he was a botanist. He did have an eye for the detail of what he was illustrating, and you find in this one there are some unusual little, well, that's what we believe is Government House that's on the side of the government domain, the flagstaff. But there's also, it's hard to see here, but it's like a little area that's fenced off, so we don't know whether that might be one of the earliest coal mines. And the tents here, and also this little, it's like it's a diggings, or whether or not they did a test trench for mining or something. It's got interesting detail in it. That's just to show you what Government House looked like. So that was done by Edward Close, and the timing of this is quite interesting, that it was done around the time of the Big Report. So I've been looking at a lot of these artworks as public documents. So they're actually, you read them with the Big Report and other documents. There's an actual purpose in why he was doing it, and I think it was as evidence as to what was happening in the colony. This is another interesting one. John Lewin was a professional artist, but when he came to the colony, there wasn't a lot of work for artists, so he was put to work by the government, so he would have been commissioned to do this work, which has interesting detail that, you know, it's a lovely landscape painting, but then they've gone over and renamed Newcastle, crossed out Kingstown, labelled Signal Hill, and then put like the harbour depths. So again, that's a government document that's showing the officials elsewhere, the growth of the town, and also Government Houses. That's that site that we're talking about. And just another one of Brown, who was a convict, and just the relationship there was with the convicts and the commandants, and one would draw, the other would engrave, so it was a lovely collaboration, and how they just made use of these convicts, you know, that was the skill that they had. But, you know, it shows Aboriginal people up on the big obelisk site, and then the campfires over on Stockton side. And this one here is done by Lord Preston, and it shows coal mine at the back of Government House. So there is detail in it if you look close, that often it does, you know, show a lot of government infrastructure and what was happening. And this last one is one looking back towards the cathedral. There are the government gardens in here. So they've got the sheep, they've got the cattle. This would all be the James Fletcher site. And Aboriginal people here on Fletcher Park. So that's another one by Edward Close that I think was done showing Government House at the top of the hill, but again, not showing people, but showing the infrastructure, the buildings that are in the town, that I think is really what's relevant. The concept care has been used quite broadly in this chapter to show that although care was not always outwardly evident, convict workers managed from the government domain were attempting to improve conditions and provide benefits to the inhabitants. This chapter has not so much followed the same line of care of convicts as Stephen Nicholas's care, who widely is written about in terms of convicts in Australia, but has used the context of a small penal outpost and how it helped provide the greater colony. It was at Newcastle that the groundwork was laid for the coal industry. Considering the haphazard way the penal settlement and the coal industry came about, it is extraordinary that the settlement survived to become one of the world's biggest coal emporiums. Chapter 2 covers the military barracks and the care of the girls. It looks at the next phase of use and traces the use from 1841 to 71. The colonial government was still in its infancy in the 1830s and coming to terms with responsibility towards caring for its inhabitants. This was a period of trial and error, of haphazard planning, where the authorities made genuine attempts to provide the order and care that may one day sustain a self-governing colony. The domain came to the attention of the imperial government during the 1830s when it was considered for the site of the new military barracks. And although plans were drawn up in 1835, it was not until 1841 that the military barracks were completed. What activated the domain was a significant building program that saw the military barracks constructed. So again, as soon as there's like a government intervention building program, we get a lot of documentation. So there's strong flavour of artworks being produced to show what's happening. So I'll show you the plans. These plans are over in the British Archives, and they would have been drawn up around the late 1830s. That shows the James Fletcher site, where the barracks are to be situated, and this is Watt Street. And this one here, which is beautifully coloured. So we've seen copies of them here, but these originals are all sitting over in the Kew Archives. This one here is of the military hospital, which is now used by, referred to as Monet's. So cafe in the corner of the site. And just another one showing the officers' quarters, which is different to the military barracks. So they look similar, but this one's actually quite small. It's shorter, but this one's a military barracks. It sort of shows neatly, the layout of what's there. These buildings were designed and constructed and maintained by the Imperial authorities for the use of the troops stationed in Newcastle to protect the coal mining and coal ready for shipment. As such, the troops' presence supported the growth of infrastructure and commerce in Newcastle, ensuring that the Macquarie Pier would be completed to provide a safe harbour for the export of coal. The barracks at the government domain are associated with the transition of imperial responsibilities to the self-governing colonial authorities. The cost of constructing the military buildings at Newcastle was considerable, and it would happen, and as it would happen, they would not be extensively used for the purpose for which they were built, because they were only there for a short period to 1851. Although the British Ordnance Office ceased to have a presence at the site, they continued ownership of the military buildings and called on the colonial government to preserve the buildings. They also wanted the colonial government to be mindful to whom the buildings would be leased to, and concerned that inappropriate tenants would occupy the fine buildings, possibly neglecting and destroying the still new structures. The Imperial government did not support the idea of putting the buildings out to public competition or tender, instead wanted the buildings properly cared for and maintained. Proposals for the buildings included their use as a candle factory, a school, a fever hospital and a slaughterhouse. None of these were acceptable to the British Ordnance Office, who preferred the buildings to be partially tenanted rather than being occupied by an undesirable enterprise, believing that an empty house was better than a bad tenant. During this time, the 1850s, the community began to use the domain. The voluntary forces trained there. Many of the military buildings were occupied by various colonial government organisations. When the Imperial forces left in 1851, the colonial community-based voluntary regiment was formed. The formation of the volunteer brigade was a turning point in the way the colony took control and responsibility from the Imperial regulars to protect itself. Cricket was played at the parade ground and was part of the training of these volunteers. That was during the 1860s, and as there was no large civic park or public dedicated recreational grounds available in the town, some hoped that the site would become a botanic garden or public facility. Instead, authorities floated the idea in 1866 of a lunatic asylum at the site. However, there was much opposition, and this didn't eventuate until 1871. So just to quickly show you a few images of the volunteers. Oh, that's just one I put up just to show how that's the plan, and then that's what is still there today, just below New Common Street. So here's some images of the volunteers. Now these photographs, I thought originally they may have been from the 1860s, which would make them fairly old, but I've since found out that the volunteers trained there for a few decades even after the asylum opened. So these are probably likely the 1880s or 1890s. A couple of them are postcards too, which I didn't realise until recently. I went and looked at the originals, but it shows the cricket ground, cricket pitch here. And this was the male side of the asylum. So we'll get to the female side in a moment, which is a lot more decorative. The field ambulance, I think, we've got the guns, the wall just along Ordnance Street at the back there. There's the field ambulance. These buildings here have been since demolished, so they were sort of structures that came out from the barrack buildings. So we'll get to the girls. So the existing tenants prior to 1867 had not posed a threat to the local community. On the contrary, they stood for order, protection and the rule of law. The local community was outraged when the decision was made to send wayward girls from Sydney to occupy the neighbourhood. Government authorities, however, were taking responsibility to care for these children. What resulted was a volatile dynamic between authorities and the local community in accepting this new caring institution. The Newcastle Industrial Girls School, School for Girls, opened in 1861, and 2 years later the Newcastle Reformatory for Girls was established, both institutions operating at the site simultaneously till 1871. The Industrial Schools Act was implemented in a militant and ordered way in this very male environment, with the care of the girls not being educational but rather enforced discipline that reflected the old penal system. There's numerous newspaper articles about the girls, and Jane knows quite well. She's been doing some research on them. So report after report of these girls that played up a treat, they rioted, apparently worse than any men that people had tried to manage in the past, and they sent a posse from Sydney to Newcastle for 3 months. But the punishment was harsh, but some of them were in solitary confinement for up to 7 days, and considering that a lot of them were neglected, they weren't exactly criminal. Despite it being a genuine attempt by colonial government to ease the growing problem of neglected and delinquent children in New South Wales, these institutions were unsuccessful, with the children being transferred to Cocktail Island in Sydney of 1871. The buildings would only be empty a few months before the colonial government would launch yet another new venture, an asylum. Although the uses already described had been fixed and short-term, after the volunteer forces and girls left, this began a period when the community began to use the government domain. The volunteer forces continued to use the place during these years, and it proved beneficial when the asylum was to finally open, because it provided a way for the community to engage with the new idiot and imbecile classes that would be introduced there. This proved particularly fruitful when moral therapy was implemented in the 1870s. So we move now to Chapter 3. With the closure of the girls' institution, this provided yet again the opportunity for authorities to trial other regulations and enabled a new purpose as an asylum. Although lunacy policy existed, planning for the asylum at Newcastle was minimal. It was an accidental asylum, came about haphazardly as a response to the overcrowded asylums in Sydney. A recent article by Stephen Garton suggests that asylums in New South Wales have gained undeserved negative reputations throughout the 20th century. He argues that some asylums did provide genuine and therapeutic conditions for patients during the 19th century, and this could provide a model for future mental health care. Defines 3 crucial issues relating to the lunacy system in the 19th century. Firstly, the influential approach of moral reform that was a distinct system of mental health care that differed from the medical approach of treating insanity. Secondly, it was not until numerous inquiries and reports were undertaken, political leaders began to argue for reform and for a more formal approach and proper management of lunatic asylums. Thirdly, Garton states that the 1868 Lunacy Amendment Act was a turning point enabling other non-jail-like institutions to materialise, saw the institution for asylum idiots established. Garton calls for studies of particular asylums so we can gain a sense of the contributions and find positive stories about them. That call is taken up in this chapter, exploring the circumstances that led to the establishment of the Newcastle Asylum and why in the second half of the 1800s the asylum functioned reasonably well and used moral therapy. Moral therapy had 4 components: supervision, classification, activity and employment, and exercise. This treatment focused on managing behaviours associated with insanity rather than seeking a cure. And it usually, institutions were managed by non-medical professionals rather than the medical profession. The decision to open the asylum at Newcastle was not directly driven by the community, as in Britain, but was a strategy supported by colonial authorities. Despite these origins, the institution which emerged became the first regional and specialist government asylum in the colony to care for imbecile and idiot patients. It has now outlived all its contemporaries. Part 2 of this thesis traces the development of intellectual disability and mental health care on the site up to the 1900s, discusses the evolution of mental health care as well as the development of asylums in New South Wales. It also looks at the origins of care of intellectually disabled groups in Britain and compares its charitable schemes with the state care intervention in Australia. And I guess that group, I didn't realise when I started this research that it did start out as an institution for intellectually disabled people. So that took me on a completely different tangent. So I've had to go and look at how it was different in Britain, why it was different here. And there's one author that had done a bit of work on asylums in the Northern Hemisphere. Australia actually fits when I was sort of here. So there was Austria, Finland, Italy, Japan came afterwards. But the interesting thing is that it was the third public institution that I can find for this group of people. There's several possible reasons why moral therapy may have been taken up in the 80s, 70s at the Newcastle Asylum. Firstly, this was a specific group who was seen as incurable and needing long-term care. They were quite a class than the general insane classes that were preferred because of the close proximity of the asylum to the neighbouring residents. So the residents had been really firm and strong in voicing their opinion about who they wanted there. So whether or not this was a strategy used by the government to appease the community. Secondly, non-medical personnel in other parts of the world usually manage this class, and there was a genuine belief in the effectiveness of early education and training of imbecile and idiot classes. So we have this gentleman, Frederick Kane, he was a clerk at an institution in Sydney and then all of a sudden becomes a superintendent here. The asylum is open to the community and visitors, so I might just skim over this because I know we're probably running out of time. Yeah. This chapter also just covers, I look at the visitors book that's related to the institution, and there were clergy, there were official visitors, entertainers, and the general community. So from a period of 1881 to 1891, there were 2,693 visitors. The biggest group came from to provide divine service, so they were from the religious fraternity. There were a lot of international visitors. Some were government officials who inspected the management of the asylums, coming from as far as India, the United States. So this whole culture of people moving through asylums worldwide, collecting knowledge and transferring information. The minstrels, there's quite a few notations of minstrels who provided entertainment during the 1880s and 1890s, performing, so it's like a social experience that also included the community involvement as well. So there's a whole area of institutional tourism phenomena during this time, and I was lucky enough to be told about a postcard. Actually, so that's just showing the site. This is the female side of the asylum. So the side that we looked at before where the military were training, that was in front of the military barracks. Well, this was the women's asylum and the ornate gardens. So this whole area was opened up to the community, and the patients actually worked there, worked in the gardens. That's just, this chapter analyses the photographs in tandem with a plan that was done by the government architect. So the government architect at the time wasn't sort of designing the buildings, but he actually did a lovely plan of the landscape of the garden. So I try, and because he labels everything, it's a good overview to see. That's the plan I was talking about. It was done in the 1880s. So it labels the names of the gardens, and there's aviaries, there's fountains, drying racks out the back for the laundry. It's very detailed, so I've been able to analyse that for some of the photographs to work out the site. There were also people from visiting ships that were in the harbour. So we had HMS Kalisar. They mentioned some of the people from that ship that were there. There was also, in 1883, Japanese surgeons visited the asylum from the Japanese man of war called the Takuba, which is one of the 2 ships sailing the southern oceans with a crew of Japanese medical officers researching causes of beriberi. So I thought it's interesting. It was sort of a port they came to, but then they visited the asylum. They had a game of skittles with the patients, so it's all very interesting, this whole mix of people coming from. I might just, that's a postcard that someone alerted me to, that we're on we're planning a walk of the site, and she came across that. So that sort of fits out a whole area of institutional tourism and how people were visiting these sites, buying postcards and sending them backwards and forwards. This chapter also analyses Catherine Piddick. She's done a lot of work at asylums in Tasmania and South Australia, looking at what was the ideal asylum model in Britain and how much of that was transferred to New South Wales and Australia. So she's come up with this criteria. The work that she's done on mainly purpose-built asylums, she's applied this to them to say that the purpose-built asylums weren't perfect for the conditions here in Australia. So her basic conclusions are that what was planned, adapted here, weren't terribly successful. A lot of them didn't last. This same criteria applied to the asylum at Newcastle, being a military barracks, actually ticked many of the boxes, which was quite interesting. So I thought I'd just put that up there so just get an idea of how this was really not a purpose-built. It was an accidental asylum, but it's lasted the years, maybe because of some of these criteria. Now, Chapter 4 looks specifically at the Newcastle Asylum as an institution for intellectually disabled and surveys the official medical records to investigate the patients admitted between 1871 and 1900. So there's about 900 patients were admitted. It looks at the patterns of admission and the dislocation of many of these patients from society. The first group that was admitted there in 1871 are analysed, and it appears that many of them were admitted on an ad hoc basis, transferred from various parts of the colony and mainly from other government institutions. This group were mostly ageing immigrant men. The analysis raises questions about whether these patients were really imbecile or idiots at all, or whether there was simply too much inertia in the system at the time to embrace the radical change of having a new institution set up. But this asylum at Newcastle was instead used as a dumping ground for mostly the ageing population who had no social supports. And it took several decades for the institution to have a predominant intellectual disabled population. The final chapter looks at the importance of the broad historical narrative that helps develop a comprehensive heritage conservation analysis. Historical knowledge enriches the heritage analysis and together helps provide truthful interpretations and meanings about government domain. This chapter examines how the Australian heritage discourse has changed dramatically in recent years and explores what cultural heritage means in the 21st century. Today it is a fluid concept having tangible elements rather than just looking at a physical place or objects. Heritage in 2012 is both culturally constructed and politically shaped, and this chapter reviews changes to heritage and planning legislation that has allowed this place, the government domain, to fall through the gaps in terms of cultural heritage. The place is a vulnerable site. It remains on the periphery due to the stigma associated with mental health phases during the 20th century. This is a double-edged sword in terms of heritage. One advantage of the domain remaining a mental health site is that it's had a low impact of human traffic and minimal disturbance to the hospital grounds. Therefore, heritages remain hidden and protected. This has helped retain the integrity of the built environment. Any other use during the 20th century may not have seen the place as in good condition. However, the lack of contact with the site has contributed to the place going mostly unrecognised in terms of heritage and puts at risk this almost forgotten place. Some interest in the government domain has come about through the University of Newcastle's Coal River Working Party that encourages research of regional history and input from the community. This group uses a multidisciplinary approach looking at contemporary heritage matters, also enables the community to raise issues about heritage and history of the region. It's important that local places are identified by local people. The following model shows, this just relates I guess to the other slide, but it's just showing the veranda at the top and the open space. There was access to the dormitories, which was in that criteria that I had built up before. I'll skim over these because these just show you what the medical records look like. This model developed in this thesis is one that reflects the Coal River Working Party and the whole theme of having community base and very multidisciplinary, so it encourages people from a broad cross-section of community, academic and professions, so geologists, archaeologists, architects. It's a model that sort of worked for trying to highlight the importance of a lot of these areas. Despite heritage listing, the government domain remains vulnerable due to its coastal location. Government authorities have sold off many public buildings over the past decades. Public infrastructure was once a significant part of the city's landscape. However, this is slowly being eroded as government places are either closing down or moving out of the Newcastle city centre. Withdrawing their functions from long-established sites created a real threat to public heritage. Although this is a worldwide phenomenon, it is more pronounced in Australia because of the strong culture of government infrastructure that has previously existed. Only a limited sample of government heritage places continue to survive in public hands in Australia. The community needs to begin talking about these places to remain because they belong to the people. There is no need to sell off or demolish public buildings. Instead, we need a discussion about how the site can transition into a new public use. Today, the domain is at the crossroads, both in terms of mental health care and heritage conservation, both needing urgent attention. A new mental health care paradigm is needed in Australia, suggested by Professor Patrick McGorry, who was Australian of the Year in 2011. He talks about there needs to be a shift towards increasing community support for people with mental illness. In terms of Australian heritage discourse, this has already been discussed as that already has been changing in the last 10 years. By having a better understanding of the history of government care, particularly at the Newcastle Asylum, this can give us some clues as to how to better improve Australia's mental health system by adopting community approaches that support those now living in the community with mental illness. Although mental health care and heritage are intrinsically linked at this site at Newcastle, these dual associations create a tension. They are not a neat fit in terms of providing contemporary mental health care. Despite these challenges, this historic mental health site could see benefits to the community in terms of care, both in relation to the site itself and the wider community, as there is a growing body of literature suggesting the benefits of cultural heritage and what it can bring to the physical and mental well-being. So studies that are done in Aboriginal communities measuring their mental health, physical well-being, and the contact that they have with their culture. There's a lot of studies in that area, and I think that in the future there seems to be more work gone into that I hope that this site and I guess the heritage of this site can sort of bring about. Heritage precincts and parklands can encourage walkability, providing that connection to places where communities can engage socially and recreationally. So it's reflecting back on how this site was used in the 1800s and how it was an open place to the community. Opening up the site to patients, staff, families, or others that have a connection with the site. So with these medical records that I've looked at, I'm not sure how how many of like families today or people know the records were thought to have been lost only up to fairly recently. So I just think there's the possibility for this site, for families and people to really engage with the site once they find out more about the records. And the same as what Jane's doing with the getting the names of all the girls up online and their social histories is really pulling people towards the site. In concluding, this presentation has shown that the Newcastle government domain is evidence of a haphazard planning for care in the colony. Planning that in fact began not with care but with coal that offered the colony an economic base. What continues to exist at the Newcastle government domain is exceptional in its evidence of multiple layers of history, all intertwined, from mining and military to moral care and medicine, all these before us at this very unassuming place. The government domain presents the needs of the people, the situations and problems that arose that were not easily addressed. Many of the problems are already at crisis point by the time authorities tried to remedy them. They needed to act because there was simply no other social supports, no non-government organisations to take up the slack. There is no longer the open asylum, the moral care, or what they call the out-of-door therapy that helps reinforce interactions between the wider community and those needing care. Perhaps this is something as a community we need to revisit. The phrase an open asylum came out of a government document, again over in the Kew archives. There's no author, there's no name on the document, but it was obviously a government, British Imperial government document. The phrase an open asylum was perhaps a warning to imperial authorities of extensive problems of care needed in New South Wales for decades to come. An open asylum describing a place with no foundations of modern society that could adequately provide the necessary care that was needed almost immediately on the British arriving in New South Wales. The place was an asylum without boundaries or borders, and it is this that has helped entrench a strong culture of care that still exists today. So just to end, there's many examples of how this whole culture is still present there today. An example, this was in the Herald back in July, but just the theme of care, and it's very broadly used here, that they're just asking for like expressions of interest from the community about care, about the care of the country, you know, whether it relates to the environment, asking people to have input into this whole idea of to make the place a better place, I guess. Also the recent example of the Commonwealth Government challenging cigarette companies in regard to clean packaging and winning. So, you know, that's again an example, I guess, of Australia taking the lead in this area that they made. It's part of some culture that has come through over the years. So that finishes.